Yeah, it's been a while since I've played the didgeridoo, but I can still circular breathe here and there. Yeah, well, thanks for the introduction. I don't suppose many of you know me, so I'll tell you, first of all, who I am and how I came to be here. My name's Andrew. Hi. I grew up in Cheshire. In 2002, I graduated with an honours degree in biochemistry from the University of Wales in Bangor. Very quickly decided that I didn't want to play with test tubes and DNA, and somehow found myself on the end of a pile of branches feeding a chipper, which I loved. And before long, I was swinging around playing with chainsaws and doing all the things that a climbing arborist would do. In the early part of 2006, I emigrated accidentally to New Zealand, where I've been ever since. There's a story behind that. Where I've been ever since. I initially carried on working as a climber, transitioned into management, and sort of during that time I decided to re-educate, so I enrolled in a degree program through MySCO via correspondence, and in 2011 I graduated with a degree in arboriculture. Since then I've worked as a consultant in Auckland, which is our largest city on the North Island, and most of what I do is trees and developments, probably like many of you consultants. Trees and developments, trees and construction, and the New Zealand equivalent of planning permission. During that time, I got accustomed to and became exposed to lots of different recommendations, standards, best practice documents that were intended to guide our decisions when we make these recommendations. And I started asking some questions about where some of these recommendations were coming from. And in the absence of finding the answers that I was seeking, in 2016, about 3 years ago, I enrolled, as Vicky said, as a PhD student at the University of Canterbury. And so for the last 3 years, I've been researching the effects of construction damage on trees, and specifically root pruning, which I'm going to tell you about for the next, hopefully, 30 minutes. So I realize this is quite different to everything else we've heard about the last couple of days, but bear with me. Now, the way that I've put this together, the title of the talk is What We Know, What We Don't Know, and some things we've learned recently. So the what we know, I'm going to give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour of some of the literature. Quickly have a look at how that ties into what we do in practice. The what we don't know are 3 of the research questions which I asked as part of my PhD research, and some things we've learned recently. I'm going to introduce you to some of what I've been doing, and I'm going to show you some results. It does get a bit data heavy towards the end, hopefully not too many hangovers this morning, but I'll hopefully finish with some quite succinct and important take-home messages. The first 2 slides are interactive. There's one more halfway through. I do very much encourage audience participation. It makes this whole thing a lot more fun and it helps me to relax, so please feel free to get involved. So why are roots important? There are 4 bullet points here. Who wants to kick us off? What do trees need roots for? What do they do?
Stability.
Bang! You got it in the right order. Thank you very much. Next one. What was this gentleman just talking about?
Water uptake.
Water uptake. You can't. Water up. Glad I was paying attention. So was he. Water uptake. 2 more. Think outside the box a little bit. Storage. Oh, you guys are great. This is all in the right order. No stooges. All right. One more. This one, I think Luke talked a little bit about this on Monday. Yeah. So I've just put it as chemical signaling, and the example I've given here is abscisic acid, okay? A lot of information from below ground comes to the top of the tree through the roots via abscisic acid, which is very important in stomatal control. Okay. 5 points. Why do we prune roots? Can we think of any examples, any situations we might find ourselves in where we're chopping roots off trees?
Physical damage.
Yes, I'm talking about particular scenarios, specific instances.
Right. Is that moving?
All right, I'll start you off. Utility installation. All right. Trip hazards. Yeah, okay. In what? Think about what?
Highways.
All right, footpath repair, okay. 3 more. Think 5837.
Drainage.
Housing developments. Any kind of construction, new buildings.
Drainage and ditches.
Drainage and ditches. You can help me with my next presentation because I haven't got that one on it, but yes. Okay, there are 2 more here. Transplanting.
Limit growth.
we'll come to that. Do you want to come and help me, actually? That's great. Transplanting, I suspect that tree's probably lost a few roots when it's been plucked out of the ground. So there's one more on there.
Subsidence or direct damage?
Potentially. Damn, I should have prepared better for this, shouldn't I?
The cacao grows. Fruit production.
I'm looking at you over there. Why did you butcher all those trees? Gilman.
This is your presentation.
Oh, come on. Nursery production. So we see a lot of times when we start manipulating the roots of nursery trees, we can have a positive effect. So it's these first three really where I've focused my research interests and where I'm going to be steering the direction of the talk. So the way I've sort of put this together as we look at this research is a sort of a timeline of events, and it starts a long time ago, and hopefully we'll finish up with what I've been doing today. When I put it together, I wanted to see, I guess, how far back in time I could go to see where our understanding of root pruning really began. And so the first two that I'm going to show here are just points of interest, things I stumbled across. So there we go. This is the earliest form of what we now know as bonsai. Of course, the art of bonsai is growing small trees, and a part of that is to restrict root growth, and prune the roots. And so we see, as far back as the 8th century, that trees are, the growth of trees is stunted as a result of root growth. Next one, and I hope I've pronounced this correctly, ablaquation. Again, a point of interest, it's a medieval technique, and the agriculturalists, the farmers, figured out that by exposing the roots of these fruiting trees and vines to the sunlight and not pruning them, but just sort of roughing them up a little bit, they could actually improve crop yields, particularly things like grapes, apples, things like that. Okay. So here's some research. This gentleman here, Rook, he is from New Zealand, I believe, and he's describing a technique here called undercutting. So this is typically things that is undertaken on forestry trees, nursery forestry trees. Maybe some foresters here familiar with this. These sort of field-grown saplings ready to be taken out to their final location. And there's a tractor with a sort of reciprocating saw that severs all those roots at a predetermined depth. And what we see, the image on the right, the root prune trees are much shorter. So we see a stunted growth, but more importantly, in this instance, it improves or it increases the amount of root growth. It stimulates root growth. It increases the root-to-shoot ratio. And that has a positive effect on post-transplant survival and success when they get taken out onto the hillside to their final location. Forward a little bit more. These particular researchers were interested in the effects of a symplastic discontinuation at the root collar. So this wasn't necessarily a root pruning exercise, it was wounding of the buttress flare, and they excised pieces of tissue, and they were looking at the effect of that on physiology. And I've sort of introduced this here as, I guess, the first instance of where this sort of analytical equipment was used for this type of investigation. On the left, we see the effect of that as causing stomatal closure. Okay, so it's a reduction in transpiration. And on the right, that is changing. I think that's leaf water potential. But what we're seeing here is the effects of that xylem embolism causing water stress symptoms. Okay, so 20 years ago, this paper by Gary Watson, I would hope many of you should be reasonably familiar with this. This, I think, is probably the first look at root pruning using a mature landscape tree. So these were a pin oak, mature pin oaks, and Gary trenched these trees on 1, 2, or 3 sides and monitored how they responded in terms of their growth for about 5 years. And we see that both DBH and shoot elongation were reduced in comparison to the controls for 5 years, as well as a reduction in vitality. So we're starting to build up a bit of a picture of how root pruning affects these trees now. So 5, 10 years ago, this is Tom Smiley's work. Tom interested in the effects of root pruning on tree stability. So on the left, you see this sort of stump cutting root cutting machine, which is severing the roots in a straight line, incrementally closer to the tree. And on the right, a pull test system. We've heard about that this morning. And those trees are pulled usually to 1 degree. Of course, the more roots we cut off, the more we see changes in stability. Tom found a sweet spot around about 3 times dBH. If you get much closer than that, we start to see some quite profound and statistically significant effects on tree stability. So we get to around about here, shameless plugging. Anyone would think I was after a job? And we see a lot of Dr. Gilman's work. And much of this, the work that Ed has done, looked at root ball shaving, root ball slicing, and sort of selective root removal of nursery trees, pot-grown trees. And so root pruning is not all bad. What we can see here is improving post-transplant survival. Okay, and it can improve post-transplant stability, and also it improves root system architecture as well. Okay, so these 2 papers, besides the work that I've done myself, 2 of probably the most recent pieces of information we have on root pruning. And again, I introduced these because we're starting to see the use of laboratory equipment, analytical equipment, to reveal some of the signs of stress that you wouldn't ordinarily see with the naked eye. Okay? Paper on the left by a good friend of mine, Alessio Fini from Italy. He's looking at the effects of root pruning on a lime and a horse chestnut. They would have been, from memory, about that big, so juvenile, early mature tree. And on the right is a Chinese fir. Don't worry too much about interpreting the graphs. What you're looking at there is the effect of root pruning on carbon assimilation and overall tree transpiration. And both of those things are reduced because of stomatal closure. Okay? It's water stress, basically. We're initiating, causing these water stress symptoms. Okay, so this one's interactive. 4 bullet points. What do we know about root pruning? It's bad, yes. Think about the bonsai. What happened to the bonsai trees? Right. Paul, what you taught? You showed us a slide this morning with the footpath and something happened to the trees. What happens when you chop the roots off? Stability. Okay, so it's not all bad. Think about Dr. Gilman's work. What else do we know? Stimulates root growth. Yeah, I'm going to say that. It can improve root system architecture, post-transplant success. Yeah, exactly. It can remove girdling roots. And the last one, some of the most recent work, I think is John Banks here. Yep. Causes water stress. We can see some quite profound changes in tree physiology. So we know that trees need roots. We know they're important, and we know why. We also know that we need to chop them off in the urban environment. And so what we see is the preparation or the delivery of these types of best practice documents, these guidance documents. And these are designed to guide and inform our decisions as we make recommendations about tree protection. Now, occasionally the research feeds directly into that. A great example is Tom Smiley's work. He looked at tree stability. Remember the sweet spot, around about 3 times dBH, and we see that appearing in the American standard. Other things we see are tree protection zones or root protection areas. Everyone's sort of familiar with that from 5837? Yep. So that's usually a circle on an unimpeded root zone with a radius equivalent to 12 times the trunk diameter. Occasionally we'll see encroachment thresholds. The Australian standard's a good example of that. The recommendation is not to take more than 10% or encroach more than 10% into that tree protection zone. Other things we see are individual root pruning specifications. I believe the National Joint Utilities Group guidelines and 5837 specify 25 millimeters. Is that still right? Yep. Don't cut roots bigger than 25. That is very much how things are done in New Zealand, with this sort of fixed diameter threshold for selective root removal. So, some unanswered questions. Now, there are lots of unanswered questions. This is by no means all of them. But these are the questions that I've asked as part of my PhD research. How big does a tree protection zone need to be? It's typically a circle with a radius of 12 times dBH, right? Look at the work of Harris. It can be as little as 6, as much as 18. So the question is, how much space should we give these trees? How close can we trench in a straight line when we do a utility trench or a footpath repair? How close can we get to those trees before we start causing some really serious problems? And this has really formed the backbone of my research, is there's a lot of words there, how do we account for cumulative root loss relative to the size of the tree when we're selectively removing roots? So if we think, don't remove a root that's bigger than 25 millimeters in diameter, that doesn't really account for the size of the tree, and it doesn't really account for how many roots you're removing. Okay? A small tree is going to respond very differently to a large tree when you take away a 25 millimeter diameter root. So is there an alternative to that when we're removing roots individually? So that sort of brings us roughly up to where we are. 2 years ago, I was fortunate enough to be able to spend some time in Florida, courtesy of the Tree Fund. I had 2 experimental sites there. I guess Ed and Rob will probably recognize those 2 locations. And I tried to answer some of these, my research questions. So this is site number 1 up at the top. And the question I've asked here is, how big does a tree protection zone need to be? So these are Quercus virginiana, a live oak tree native to Florida. I had 18 of those trees. I would have liked more. This was all I could get my hands on. And I wanted to test a reasonably wide range of tree protection zone sizes. So you can see I made these sort of circular trenches around the tree with radial offsets, 3, 6, 9, 12, and 15 times dBH, plus a control. That gave me 3 reps. And I monitored those trees, the responses of those trees over 1 growing season. Site number 2, again, this is a live oak, another Quercus virginiana, slightly larger tree, and this is research question number 2. So how close can we get to these trees with a trench before we start causing problems? 31, nothing like a prime number for an experimental design. That gave me 3 treatments, 3, 6, and 12 times dBH offsets, plus a control. That was 8 reps plus 7 controls. And again, I monitored these trees over 1 growing season. I was in Columbus at the ISA conference last year, and I had a little bit of time and a little bit of money left over to very quickly get back to Florida, and I was able to look at these trees again. So I have sort of a second data point at the end of that second growing season. Now, I made all of these trenches with an air spade at both sites. And the reason I did that is because I'm trying to quantify the root loss for each of these trees individually. And the way that I did that was very laboriously, measured the diameters of each and every one of those roots that came off, right down to 2 millimeters in diameter. And from that, I was able to estimate a cross-sectional area of each root. Now, when I add all those up, I get a combined cross-sectional area of roots for each tree, okay? When I divide that number by the trunk cross-sectional area at any given height, x, usually it's breast height, 1.4 meters, okay? I'm then expressing that total amount of root removal relative to the size of the tree, and I just call that AR. It's an area ratio, okay? This is very loosely based on the allometric scaling that we heard John talk about yesterday, and the pipe model as well, which I think Luke alluded to. I'm going to pause there. Does anybody have any questions on this? Is everyone reasonably comfortable with this? Yeah? Cool. So, I've got some trees. I've chopped off some roots. Now I just need to see what happens, right? So I looked at all the usual growth responses. Think about the bonsai. Small trees, growth is reduced. So I looked at trunk diameter growth, shoot extension, and new leaf area. I also looked at some physiology. I do have quite a lot of physiological data. I'm just going to tell you about the leaf water potential today. Pre-dawn leaf water potential. It's a very, very sensitive measure of water stress. Unfortunately, we have to do this very early in the morning, between 3 and 5 o'clock. That's the trees at site 1 at about 2:45 after several gallons of coffee, I think, probably. It's a very lonely exercise at that time in the morning, especially as a PhD student. I have to work alone. Nobody wants to get up at 2 a.m. to muck around with trees. But invariably, I would have plenty of company from Florida's local arachnid population that would come out in droves, usually about 6 foot between 2 trees. Just catch them with their head tops like that. Wonderful, wonderful experience. So here's some results. So this is site number 1. This is experiment number 1. Okay. This is how big does a tree protection zone need to be. This is the water potential response. Across the bottom, we have the number of days since the roots were severed. And on the left is the water potential response, all right? Of course, water potential is always a negative number, okay? So the more negative it is, the more stressed those trees are. Unsurprisingly, 3, 6, and 9 times DBH treatments, all quite significantly stressed all the way to the end of that study. The interesting thing for me was about 8 weeks in, what we saw was that the 12 times DBH treatment was also significantly reduced in comparison to the controls. So that's telling me that those roots right on the outside are actually quite important. Growth response, this is possibly where I'm suffering a little bit from low reps. The standard errors are quite large. A few more trees probably would have tidied this up. Nevertheless, the 3 times DBH treatment was significantly reduced in comparison to the control. Shoot extension, this has performed pretty well for me usually. 3, 6, and 9 times DBH, all significantly reduced. Yeah. Leaf area, again, a few more trees probably would have tidied this up. The 3 times DBH treatment, making smaller leaves, okay? The reason trees are going to make smaller leaves, water leaves the tree through the leaf, through the stomata, right? This particular species has a hydraulic strategy. It's called anisohydric. What that enables that tree to do, it holds its stomata open for much longer during periods of water stress. The advantage of that is that carbon assimilation can continue, okay? So there is carbon coming into the tree. The disadvantage to that is water will continue to leave the tree even when there's a deficit or a shortage underground. And that can expose the photosynthetic mechanism and other physiological processes to some damage. Okay, so this is site number 2. This is my trenching experiment. Okay, how close can we get with the trench? Again, the number of days across the bottom and the water potential on the side. Notice the axis break after day 102. So up to day 102 is the first season's response, and day 440 was a day in early August last year. Day 45 is where things really started to happen for these trees. All of them were stressed. And we see this sort of initial period of recovery for the 12 times DBH treatment, possibly some new roots growing. Okay, I backfilled these trenches, so we're probably seeing some new root growth alleviating some of those water stress symptoms. Round about here, I had a visit from a young lady called Irma. Made for a very interesting evening, not just for myself, but for my trees as well. I spent all evening watching these hurricane-force winds just smashing these trees around. I was terrified. I just thought that was it. My PhD's out the window. Lost all my data. But no, they all survived. But I think that's what we're seeing here as these water stress symptoms start to re-emerge in the 12 and the 6 times DBH treatments. It's the result of fine root mortality. These trees are just getting bashed around so much. We see root fracturing, particularly those new, quite delicate roots. Important point from this one is that the 3 times DBH treatment all the way through that study was water stressed, and right up until 440 days, about 14 months later. Some growth responses, trunk diameter growth, no real effects as a result of the treatment there. Shoot extension, again, this always performs well for me. All treatments significantly reduced as a result of that root pruning treatment. Similar story for the leaf area response. Again, remember, those trees, it's an anisohydric species. It's making smaller leaves because there is water continually leaving through those stomata. So by making smaller leaves, it's reducing that total transpirational surface area. And all treatment effects had subsided. They were absent after the second growing seasons. The Quercus virginiana, it's quite a resilient species. It's pretty tough. Okay. So, think back to my area ratio, my root cross-sectional area ratio. This is the water potential response for both sites. I sincerely hope nobody's blue-red colorblind. I'm sorry if you are. Each of those data points represents a single tree. This is the seasonal mean water potential result for the 2017 growing season. So each data point is a single tree, and it's the average of 5 water potential results. Okay? Highly significant relationships in both instances, and a lot of that variance explained by that variable. But the relationship was a straight line. Okay? I was hoping for some curvature. I didn't get it. Trunk diameter growth. That variable performed quite well, or certainly better, when the roots came off in a circle on all sides. Not so well when they came off in a straight line. So that's sort of telling me that those peripheral roots, okay, on the outside edge of the tree, are actually playing a really important role in tree growth and vitality. Shoot elongation, again, similar story, both significant, but it performed much better when the roots came off in a circle. Same story with the leaf area response as well. Again, all those relationships were linear. They were a straight line. So, some things we've learned recently. These are my research questions. So how big does a tree protection zone need to be to avoid negative effects on tree health? Well, for Quercus virginiana in Florida, if you want to avoid the water stress symptoms, it needs to be bigger than 12 times DBH. And if you want to avoid negative growth effects, for Quercus virginiana in Florida, it needs to be bigger than 9 times DBH. How close can we get to a tree with a utility trench before we start causing some real problems? Well, the answer to that is somewhere between 3 and 6, okay? The 3 times DBH treatment sustained water stress symptoms all the way to the end, and we saw recovery in the 6 times DBH treatment. So my last question, how do we account for cumulative root loss relative to the size of the tree? Well, my allometric ratio was quite useful for predicting the responses, particularly the water potential response, but no clear threshold was observed because they were all linear. So what I was hoping for with those relationships was some curvature, so an asymptote, an inflection point, or the steepest part of the slope. Those kind of features in that relationship would allow me to identify a threshold, a point where that response changed, and so I didn't get that, unfortunately. So the most effective way to account for cumulative root loss is to estimate a percentage of the root zone which has been removed. If you have a circular root zone on an unimpeded site, you can do that very, very easily algebraically. Take home, a couple of take-home messages for you. If you want the gold star, the optimum standard of tree care, I would encourage you to implement a tree protection radius or a root protection area radius of 15 times DBH. If you can do that, great work. If you want to avoid sustained negative effects when you're doing a utility trench, try and stay at least 6 times DBH away from the tree. And avoid it if you can. Okay? No, seriously, this is really important. You don't know what the person before you has done, and you don't know what the person that's come after you is going to do. So work with your designers, your architects, engineers. Your man on the ground with the shovel really is your last line of defense. Come up with some solutions and avoid it if you can. If you have to do root cutting, improve cultural practices, I mean irrigation, mulch, any of those things that you can get in to alleviate some of those water stress symptoms, give those trees a real fighting chance. They're really good things to implement if you can. I'd say thank you to all of these people. The Tree Fund have helped me immeasurably, and all of those other names, there are various entities from New Zealand that have helped me out financially or many different ways. Everything I've told you about today has been published. The QR code there will take you to a Dropbox folder. There's a copy of the presentation in there, and also copies of all of the literature which I've discussed. Thank you very much.